People say that on every big ranch, there is a woman who disappears from every photograph. The one standing behind the stove, behind the ledgers, behind the kind of decisions folks like to think only men carry on their shoulders. At Maddox Ranch, that woman was Mara Ellison. Her name was nowhere on the deed, never raised in a toast at the town saloon. But she knew every sick cow, every leaking roof, every overdue note that almost got called in. The day Clay Maddox let it slip that she was just on the payroll, Mara understood that in his world, there was no room for anything softer than numbers. So she buried her feelings and lived like a hard-working shadow. The question was, when a man finally realizes he is wrong and reaches out his hand, does that shadow still dare to step into the light one more time? Mara came to Maddox Ranch at 22 years old, carrying a small suitcase and a letter of recommendation from the pastor in Cedar Bluff. Her parents had died in a fever outbreak. The house sold off to pay their debts. Mara thought she would stay only a few seasons, earn a bit of money, then move on. But one season bled into the next. The cattle needed someone to give them their shots. The roofs needed new shingles. The books needed someone to keep them straight. The kitchen needed someone to keep the fire going. 10 years slipped by. No one remembered the day Mara arrived anymore. They only knew that if one morning she did not get up, the whole ranch would fall apart. Her day began before the sky even thought about getting light. She built the fire, set the coffee pot over the flame, shook the ranch boys awake, and called the cowhands in for breakfast. After the men rode out to the pastures, Mara stepped into the small room off the kitchen and opened the ledger. She knew how many calves they had sold each season, which years the grass came up thin, which year the drought was worst. Every invoice, every wage paid to every hired hand passed through her hands. At night, when the house finally went quiet, she was the last one to switch off the lamps, to check the barn doors, to listen to the cattle chewing in the dark, like the slow heartbeat of some enormous creature she had somehow agreed to watch over. Clay Maddox was different. He was the face everyone pictured when they talked about Maddox Ranch. Tall, broad-shouldered, hands always stained with dust from the trail or the sweat of his horse. Clay was the kind of man people trusted to ride at the head of the herd in a sandstorm. His father had died in a riding accident. His mother had faded year by year. His younger brother had taken off on the railroad east. Clay stayed behind with the cattle, a few dozen acres, and a line of debt as long as a list of dry seasons. He was used to making quick decisions. Which calves to sell, which stock to keep for breeding, when to hire extra hands or let someone go. Mara and Clay were not strangers. 10 years under the same roof had taught them more about each other than words like boss and housekeeper could ever show. Mara knew exactly how Clay would grumble whenever the herd had to be moved. She knew he wanted his coffee strong in the morning and watered down at night. Clay knew Mara bit her lip when she wrestled with a difficult calculation, that she would rest her hand on the warm brick of the kitchen wall when she was tired, but refused to sit down. None of this was ever said out loud, but it lived between them, like the familiar creases on an old blanket that has been pulled over the same two shoulders for a very long time. Trouble started in the worst drought Cedar Bluff had ever seen. The creek shrank to a trickle. The grass burned brown. The cattle grew thin, and the sky hung over them like a sheet of hot metal. Feed bills climbed higher and higher, while the lines on the sales ledger grew shorter. Mara stared at each column of numbers and felt her chest fill with stone. Quietly, without telling anyone, she used the small inheritance from her parents. The money she had meant to use someday to buy a little room in town, to pay the land tax on the ranch. She kept the county from nailing a foreclosure notice to the front gate. Clay knew the general picture, that money had come from somewhere. He rarely asked for details. To him, if the house still stood, that was enough. Until the day the railroad man came. The man wore a clean coat and boots without a speck of mud and spread a map out on the long table in the yard. He pointed at a green line that cut right through the low ground where the creek ran. "We want to bring the tracks through here," he said. "Mr. Maddox will receive enough money to pay off his debts and live easy for a few years. That low land there, it is just where the cattle drink and a few trees. Am I right?" Mara was pouring coffee for the cowhands when she heard that. Her heart clenched. That patch of land was not just where the cattle drank. It was where Clay's father was buried, where the herd gathered on the hottest days, the last piece of land that still let the ranch breathe. She set the coffee pot down, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the table. "You cannot lay track there," Mara said. Her voice was calm but firm. "If you take that creek, the next drought will kill the herd before they make it to town." The railroad man shrugged. "Miss, I am speaking with Mr. Maddox," he said, turning toward Clay. "This is his land." Clay straightened up, eyes red from too many sleepless nights. He looked at the map, at the number written on the offer sheet, then, just for a heartbeat, at Mara. He knew she was right, but he also knew the bank would not wait for rain. Months of pressure tightened into a single moment. "Mara," he said, fighting to keep his voice even, "this is my decision. This land, this house, they are my responsibility. Please let me handle this with them." That was not the cut that went deepest. The real wound came when, out of sheer worry, Mara made the mistake of saying one more sentence in front of the hands. "Are you sure you are keeping this land for the family?" she asked quietly, "and not selling it off piece by piece just so you have less to worry about each morning when you wake up?" Clay spun around. Pride hit in its most tender place. In front of the railroad man, under the eyes of the cowhands waiting to see what their boss would do, the words snapped out of him. "If you do not like the way I keep this land, you can leave after you collect your month's pay," he said. "You are just on the payroll, Mara. I am the one who has to lose sleep over Maddox Ranch." The air froze. The railroad man smiled to himself, thinking he had finally found the crack in a stubborn rancher. The cowhands stared down into their bowls of beans, suddenly fascinated by their own spoons. No one dared say a word. Mara stood still, her hand resting on the edge of the wooden table. Her face did not change, but her eyes darkened just a shade. I understand," she said softly, just loud enough for him to hear. Then she turned back to the kitchen, picked up the coffee pot, and went on filling the cups that were waiting. That night, supper was still on the table at the usual time. The lamps still burned. The cattle were still fed. The books were still brought up to date. Only one thing had changed. From the moment Clay called her, just on the payroll, in front of the entire ranch, Mara decided to bury everything warmer than work in a place no one could ever reach again. And Clay, the man who thought he had just protected his right to be the boss, had no idea he had just lost the most important thing inside the house he believed belonged to him. After the day Clay blurted out that she was just on the payroll, Maddox Ranch did not explode. No one stormed off. No plates were broken. The next morning, the coffee was still hot on the table. The cornbread still came out golden in the pan. The cattle were still driven out to pasture. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same. Only the people living under that roof could feel that something inside had been quietly moved out of place. Mara kept working as before, maybe even more carefully than before. Her bookkeeping grew neater. She measured out supplies more precisely. She sent the hired hands to bed on time, so they would not waste their strength. But between her and Clay, what had once been a familiar little path now felt like a hanging bridge that neither of them quite dared to step onto. In the past, every so often Clay would wander into the kitchen, lean his shoulder against the door frame, and ask casually, "Did the numbers give you a headache today?" Mara would smile and answer, "If they do, I will drink a little more coffee. It will pass." The words were not many, but they were enough to warm the kitchen. After the words, "on the payroll," those scraps of conversation disappeared. Clay still came by when he needed to, but only to ask, "Any letters from the bank?" Or, "Can we cover wages this week?" Mara answered briefly, clearly, not a word missing, not a word more than necessary. The cowboys noticed first. They saw that Mara still asked about a horse's sore leg, still reminded them to take an extra coat when the wind shifted cold. But when Clay stepped into the room, her voice went quiet, as if the only thing left in the kitchen was work, not people. One evening, after supper, when the only sound left was spoons touching the sides of bowls, Clay tried to break through the distance. He stayed at the table when the others headed for the barns, until only the two of them remained, with the wall clock ticking above their heads. "Mara," he said, turning his cup between his fingers, "about the other day, I talked too hard. I just..." She looked up, her eyes calm. "You do not need to explain," she said softly. "You said I am on the payroll. I heard you very clearly. I know what my share is." "I did not mean it like that," Clay pushed on. "I was just hot." "Clay," Mara cut in, her voice still gentle. "Everyone runs hot on this ranch. You get hot over the land. The cowboys get hot over the herd. I get hot when I see the creek about to dry up. But only you have the right to call other people something in front of everyone. You called me that already. I did not argue. From now on, I will try to live exactly according to that name. That way, I will not owe anybody anything." She stood up, gathered the bowls, and walked to the sink. The conversation ended there, not with a big fight, but with the steady sound of water running over dishes. The drought dragged on. One afternoon, the mailman brought a thick envelope stamped in red. Notice of overdue land tax. Clay was out in the fields. Mara took the letter, opened it, and the number inside made her feel as if her heart dropped straight into her stomach. If it was not paid within the month, the county would issue an official foreclosure warning. That night, when the house was quiet, she opened the smallest drawer, the one that held the things no one needed to know about. A few old photographs of her parents, a flyer from a boarding house in town with the words, "Single room for an unmarried lady," and a small cloth pouch of money she had been saving for years. It was enough for her to rent herself a corner of a room, enough to start a different life, enough to leave Maddox Ranch without walking away empty-handed. Mara counted the money once, then a second time. The sum matched the amount on the tax notice, almost down to the last cent. She sat for a long time, her hand resting on the little cloth bag. No one in the house knew she had it. No one had asked her to use it. If she kept quiet, Clay would have to find his own way. Maybe he would sell off a piece of land. Maybe the railroad men would come back with another offer. Maybe the ranch would change owners. And she could go, just as she had told herself she would, so many times before. In the end, Mara let out a long breath. She slipped the cloth pouch into the pocket of her coat, took her hat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and walked out to the main road. Cedar Bluff was not far, but the distance was enough to give a woman time to think very carefully about what she was doing. At the tax office, she laid the money on the counter and signed the paper with her small name, M. Ellison. The clerk barely glanced at her. To him, it was just one more bill that had been paid. On the way back, the wind picked up. Mara pulled the scarf tight around her face. She knew she had just buried one more thing. Not her heart this time, but the small, quiet dream of a room of her own in town. She did not tell Clay about it. When he asked, "Are we all right on the land tax this month?" she simply answered, "It is paid." "The bank gave me more time?" Clay asked. "No," Mara said, turning away. "But God did." That night, as Clay walked around the cattle pens, looking up at the roof lines and down toward the creek bed, he felt something he could not quite name. The ranch was still standing, but there was something inside the house that had already slipped out of his reach. He did not yet know what it was, and Mara, sitting alone at the kitchen table, blew out the oil lamp and told herself that from now on, she would only keep this ranch alive. She would no longer let her heart live and die with it. The news that Maddox Ranch had paid its taxes on time again this year moved faster than the rare little rain clouds over the sky of Cedar Bluff. At the saloon, men clapped Clay on the shoulder. "Not bad, Maddox. Thought you'd have to sell off half your herd by now." Clay just shrugged and drained his glass. He hadn't sold. He hadn't borrowed. The taxes were paid, and he still did not know exactly how. A few days later, he stopped by the tax office to pick up some paperwork. The old clerk flipped through his ledger and said offhandedly, "Maddox Ranch, last month's land tax, all settled. Signed by, let me see, M's Ellison. One of yours?" Clay froze where he stood, his hand tightening on the brim of his hat. "She keeps the house," he answered, his voice suddenly rough. "You got any note there about where the money came from?" The clerk snorted softly. "Money is money, wherever it comes from. All looks the same once it is on the counter. We do not ask about what goes on in your home." On the ride back to the ranch, the wind blew harder than usual, but Clay barely noticed. In his mind, he saw Mara at the kitchen table, quietly bent over her books, and that small cloth pouch he'd once glimpsed in the open drawer before it disappeared. He heard again the words she had said the other night. But God did. He had thought she was joking. Now he understood that maybe God had used the little bit she had put aside for her own life to hold on to his land for him. That evening, Clay stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Mara stir a pot of soup. The lamplight pooled on her shoulders, bringing out lines of tiredness he had never really let himself see before. He wanted to ask straight out, "Why did you do it?" He wanted to say, "I know now." But when she turned and smiled, gently reminding him to come eat before supper went cold, the words stuck fast in his throat. "You heading into town early tomorrow?" Mara asked, in the same even tone as always. "Yeah," Clay said. "Word is the railroad men are coming back. They want to talk about another line of track up north." "The north side is all rock," Mara said, her hand resting on the edge of the table. "That old habit." "But it is better than taking the creek." Clay nodded. "I am not letting them touch the creek," he said. "I know how important it is." She just answered with a quiet, and did not ask anything more. The short conversation slid past like water, leaving nothing either one of them could grab hold of long enough to stay there together. In the days that followed, the ranch fell into a strange rhythm. Outside, Clay squared his shoulders against the railroad men, the bank, and the dust storms that were already being whispered about. Inside, Mara kept everything running smoothly, but she no longer stopped by the barn at night with a late cup of coffee for him. She left the cup on the kitchen table and told one of the boys to take it out. One night, the sky turned the kind of black Western folks know is not normal. The wind shifted, and the dust began to blow sideways instead of up. Clay looked toward the cattle barn, the old wooden roof, the support posts he had promised himself to fix season after season. "I will have to shore that up tomorrow," he muttered. "Not tomorrow," Mara said, standing behind him before he realized she was there. "Tonight. With this wind, a weak roof will be gone before you have time to fall asleep." He turned and caught her gaze. There was no reproach in her eyes anymore, but no softness either. Only the steady look of someone who has spent a lifetime preparing for the worst. "You stay inside," Clay said quickly. "Me and the boys can handle it." Mara did not argue. But when the first real gust came and tilted the lantern on the porch, when the barn roof started to groan in that low, dangerous way, Clay would soon find out that sometimes, even if he wanted to keep the role of the one who has to lose sleep over this place, the woman he had called just on the payroll would still run out into the storm at his side, without stopping to ask where her buried heart was. And in that storm, with the wind howling and the boards straining above them, he would finally have nowhere left to hide from the words he had owed her for far too long. That night, the wind did not blow the way it usually did. It screamed straight across the yard, flinging grit and sand against the walls like a handful of stones. The windows rattled, the porch roof creaked and groaned. The cowboys sat in the dining room, bowls in their hands, but their eyes kept drifting toward the black shape of the cattle barn in the distance. "Wind like this," one of them muttered, but he did not finish. A long, low crack echoed from the barn, deep and strained, like the sound of wood trying to cry. Clay shot to his feet, his chair tipping backwards. "To the barn!" he barked. "If that roof goes, the herd will trample each other to death." The cowboys rushed out after him. Mara rose too, her hand tightening on the edge of her apron without thinking. She looked through the glass, saw the sky torn like a shredded black tarp, the wind lifting sheets of dust so thick they almost looked solid. "You stay in the house, ma'am," one of the boys called back to her. "This kind of storm is no joke." Mara nodded, but her feet were already moving toward the door. For 10 years, she had trained herself to stay in the kitchen and let the men handle whatever happened outside. But the panicked bawling of the cattle, the deep groan of stressed timber, the sound of the wind tearing at that patchwork tin roof, all of it pounded against her chest like a summons. That piece of land, that barn, that herd, she had spent her money and her strength keeping them standing this long. The thought of sitting in the house and doing nothing suddenly felt unbearable. She grabbed a scarf, wrapped it around her neck, pulled on her coat, and stepped out into the storm. Outside, the yard was a blur of dust. The wind clawed at her face and eyes until tears ran so freely she could not tell where the sand ended and the water began. Mara bent low, shielding her face with one hand, and pushed her way toward the barn. In flashes of lightning, she could see the shapes of the men, ropes in their hands, scrambling over the roof, shouting to each other over the roar of the wind. "Mara, what are you doing out here?" Clay shouted when a streak of light showed her figure near the pens. "Get inside!" "The water trough's all tipped over," she yelled back, pointing at the line of feeders. "If the herd panics and there is no water, they will smash every post in here." There was no time to argue. Clay turned and signaled one of the hands to help her right the buckets. Mara dropped to her knees, heaving up overturned troughs, her palms burning where wet wood and sand scraped her skin. The wind slammed against her back, trying to rip the scarf from her neck. Overhead, a sharp crack split the air. The old barn had been standing a long, long time. The main crossbeam, softened by years and twisted by the storm, was giving way. Clay, up on the roof, felt the wood shudder under him. He spun around just in time to see Mara standing directly beneath, wrestling with a water trough, unaware that the beam above her was pulling away from its nails. "Mara!" he roared, but the wind devoured his voice. The beam started to fall, dragging a whole section of roof down with it. Clay jumped from the roof without thinking. He hit the ground hard, slid in the mud, and lunged forward, hand reaching. For one stretched-out second, everything seemed to slow. Only one thought was left in his mind. If Mara went down under that beam, he would lose far more than a housekeeper. He grabbed her from behind and yanked her sideways, slamming both of them against the barn wall. The beam crashed down where she had just been standing, splinters exploding into the air, a chunk of roof following it and smashing into the packed dirt with a heavy, shuddering thud. The herd bawled in blind terror. Mara found herself pinned between Clay's body and the rough barn wall, his back taking the full force of the wind, his arms wrapped tight around her shoulders and head. The smell of sweat, dust, and warm coat wool wrapped around her, so familiar it made something in her chest ache. Her ears rang with the storm, but through it she could hear his breath coming hard and fast against her neck. "You all right?" Clay's voice was rough in her ear. Mara drew in a shaky breath and gave a small nod. She had not yet found her voice when she felt his hand tighten on her shoulder. The grip of a man who knew that if he let go, he might lose something he had only just realized he was holding. In the corner of the barn, the cowboys were shouting, trying to calm the herd, ropes snapping against posts, hooves slipping on the floor. But in that narrow space between Clay's back and the wooden wall, time seemed to pause for a moment. "I was wrong, Mara," he whispered, not shouting this time, just speaking close enough that she alone could hear him. "I was wrong the day I said you were just on the payroll. You do not need Maddox Ranch. Maddox Ranch needs you, and me. I need you more than any piece of land I have." The wind still roared outside, but those words dropped between them heavier than the falling beam. Mara closed her eyes for a heartbeat, not from fear, but because it felt as if the place where she had buried her heart so carefully all this time was being dug up without her permission, whether she was ready to let it live again or not. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. The next morning, Maddox Ranch was soaked dark, mud clinging to boots, a few boards from the barn roof lying crooked in the grass. But the barn was still standing, the herd still had all their legs, and no one was badly hurt. The cowboys patched the roof while they told again how the beam had almost fallen on Mara, their voices still carrying a hint of fear. Clay worked straight through the whole morning without a break, but his eyes kept looking for Mara. She moved from kitchen to yard, carrying water to the hands, checking eggs, straightening up the corner of the barn. Everything was as usual, except for one strange thing. Every time he came near, she suddenly had her hands full with something. She did not step away, but she never stayed long either. By noon, when the cowboys went out to the well to wash up, Clay found her alone in the dining room. She was laying the tablecloth again, smoothing out the wrinkles in the old fabric. The midday light came through the window and fell across her shoulders. "Mara," he said from the doorway. We need to talk, not about the roof." She looked up and waited, not cold, not warm. "I know you are busy," Clay said slowly, "but I will make it quick. If I do not, I am afraid I will let a few more years go by." He pulled a folded envelope from inside his coat and set it on the table. I went into town earlier," he said. "Before the storm, I went to the lawyer's office." Mara looked at the envelope, then at him. "You are going to sell the land?" she asked, her voice dry. "If that is the case, you do not have to explain it to me. I am just a—" "Do not say that word again," Clay cut in, his voice suddenly hard. "Do not call yourself by that foolish line I threw at you that day anymore. Once was more than enough." He drew a deep breath, opened the envelope, and took out a sheet of paper. The lawyer's thin handwriting covered it, the black ink still fresh. "I am not selling," Clay went on. "I had them draw up papers. If anything happens to me, this place will not fall into the hands of the bank or some distant relative. Half this ranch will belong to you, not as a reward, but because that is simply what is right. You have been keeping it alive with me for a long time." Mara stood still, her hand resting on the edge of the chair. "You do not have to do that to pay me back," she said softly. "I chose to use my own money to pay the land tax. I was not expecting anything in return." "I know," Clay answered. "That is exactly why I have to. I cannot fix the past. I let you pour your little dream into those papers I did not even bother to read carefully. I let you put your name down and sign in my place, then go back to the saloon and let folks slap my back and praise me, as if I alone had kept this house standing. Last night, when that beam almost came down on you, I could only think one thing. I have been wrong in every way a man can be wrong. And if you leave, there will be nothing here left that deserves to be called a home." Mara swallowed, her eyes a little wet, but she did not let the tears fall. "You are only saying that because the storm scared you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Once the wind passes, everything will—" "No." Clay shook his head. "The storm just made me say it faster. I have been carrying these things in my head for a long time." He stepped closer, keeping just enough distance that if she wanted to step back, there would still be room. "I am sorry, Mara," he said, each word clear. "For that foolish line in front of everyone. For all the times I pretended not to see you were tired. For letting you believe that your place in this house was only by the stove and over the books, and not beside me. I was wrong, completely wrong." She gave a faint smile, but it trembled. "You think I was wrong is enough to dig up the hole where I buried everything?" she asked. "The day you called me someone on the payroll, I believed you. I buried it all so I would not have to look at the way you saw me as an outsider. And today, if you tell me I am family, I need more than one storm and one piece of paper." "I know," Clay said at once. "I am not asking you to trust me right away. I am just asking for a chance to live like a man who knows he has been wrong. You will not have to sign another tax bill with your own money. You will not have to stand alone against the railroad men. If, from now on, anyone knocks on the door of Maddox Ranch, I will be the first one to step out, and if they want to talk to the one who keeps this place, I will call you out. Not as someone on the payroll, but as the one who decides with me." He hesitated, then held his hand out into the space between them. "And if someday you still want that little room of your own in Cedar Bluff," he said more quietly, "I will be the one to load your bags on the wagon and take you there. Not to send you away, but to go with you, if you will let me. I do not want there to be any more journeys where you have to pull your suitcase by yourself. Mara looked at the calloused hand in front of her, the hand that had pulled her out from under the beam last night, that had tied reins, that had knocked on the dining room door every morning. Inside her chest, the patch of ground she had dug deep to bury her feelings suddenly cracked open, showing something still alive there, even if dry. "Do you know what scares me the most?" she asked, her voice a little warmer. "It is not the storm. It is not the debt. It is that if I take one more step toward you, someday you might call me just someone on the payroll again. I am not sure I still have enough room left to bury it one more time." Clay did not rush. He stepped back half a pace, as if to show her he was not pressing her. "I cannot promise I will never misspeak," he said honestly. "I am a man of the West, used to being slow and thick-headed. But I promise, if my mouth turns foolish again, you will not have to bury anything anymore. You just tell me, right there in front of everyone, and I will fix it, right then. I will not let another 10 years go by." This time it was Mara who laughed. A small laugh, but a true one. Tears spilled out with it, like water sloshing over the edge of a trough after the rain. She lifted her hand to wipe them away quickly, then looked at him. "All right," she breathed, as if something heavy had slipped out of her chest. "We will try again, but let me say this first. From now on, if you call me family in front of anyone, you will have to live like that is true. Family has the right to sit down and eat with you, the right to argue without being afraid they will be sent away at the end of the month." "I can do that," Clay answered, without a second thought. He took one more step, slowly lifted his hand and let it rest at her shoulder, waiting for agreement in her eyes. When he saw she did not move back, he drew her into his arms and held her close. This time not to shield her from a falling beam, but so that he himself would have something to lean on. Mara rested her forehead against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and even. Not the sound of a storm, not the sound of cattle bawling. It was only the sound of a man who had finally admitted he was wrong and wanted to make it right. In that moment, she allowed herself to believe a little more, not in long road promises, but in the truth of right now. He was holding her the way a man holds something he does not want to lose. Outside the window, the late afternoon dropped one last streak of sunlight across the fields. Maddox Ranch was still the same old fences, the patched-up roofs, the ordinary herd of cattle. But from that day on, if someone mentioned it at the Cedar Bluff Saloon, they would not just say Clay Maddox's ranch anymore. Sooner or later, they would get used to adding, "and Mara Ellison's." And the woman who had once disappeared from every photograph would no longer be just a shadow behind the stove, behind the books. She would stand in the frame beside the rancher who had held her in the middle of the storm and whispered, this time not too late, "I was wrong." In Cedar Bluff, if someone passes by Maddox Ranch in the late afternoon, they still see the same familiar things. The old fence lines, the roof patched with boards that are not quite the same color, the cattle chewing their grass as if no storm had ever swept through. But if they look a little more closely, they will notice a few small things that were not there before. Out on the porch, the wooden chair is no longer sitting by itself. There is a second one pulled up close beside it. At the long dining table, the woman who used to stand at the head of the table serving the food now sits down in the middle, a spoon in her hand. Her eyes turned sideways toward the ranch owner, as if looking at someone on the same side, not just a name written on the cover of a ledger. People still tell stories about Clay Maddox as the man who kept his father's land through many seasons of drought, who stood up to the railroad company and the bank. But slowly, in those stories, they have started to add another name, Mara Ellison. They speak of her as the one who used the money, meant for her own dream, to pay the land tax, as the one who ran out into the storm to set the water troughs back up, as the woman who stood in the kitchen but knew every breath that ranch ever took. No one dares call her someone on the payroll anymore. At the very least, no one would dare say it in front of Clay. For Mara, the house is no longer a place she is just passing through, planning to leave one day. It is a place where she has the right to stand straight, to argue back, to be a little wrong if it happens, as long as she stays to put things right together. She still gets up early, still lights the fire, still writes in the books. The only difference is that when evening falls and the porch light comes on, there is always a second shadow on the wall beside hers. Those two shadows, after learning how to apologize, how to tell the truth, and how to stop burying their own hearts, are enough to call this place a home in the true sense that people of the West, after many losses, have always quietly been searching for. If the story of the woman who buried her feelings behind the stove and the rancher who finally held her and said, "I was wrong," has touched something in you tonight, click subscribe so that every evening we can sit together again and listen to more Western love stories like this. Do not forget to hit like, leave a comment about the moment that stayed with you most from Maddox Ranch, and turn on the notification bell so you will not miss any of the journeys to come from Tales from the Wild West.